see that there's more who are coming in. The Wova platform is there for you to use, so use it as best as you can. Please make sure that you connect with someone, ask questions, let's form a community. Now, yesterday, we had the Data for Development conversation in the first session that was very successful. In that session, we discussed some of the actions that must be taken into account so that we can incorporate subnational governments into the national data system. Today, we will be talking about putting citizens at the heart of philanthropic decisions. And tomorrow we have the high-level forum on data governance. We thank all of you that have taken the time to spend these 3 hours today at this Buntwani 2021 session. Now, by way of background about Buntwani specifically, when Jay and I decided to organize Buntwani back in 2013, we were experiencing some fatigue of attending events that were more about protocol than they were about action. We really wanted to have industry-wide conversation where people said publicly what they could only be comfortable to say over coffee privately. All too often, we attended events where speakers would start by saying, let me be perfectly clear, and then they wouldn't be clear, because they would use a lot of industry jargon and they would work so hard to be politically correct, so much that it all sounds very good, but it means very little. And it does not lend itself into any action. So we decided to organize Buntwani, where people would leave their titles and trappings at the door, sit in a circle as equals. Buntwani was inspired by a place here in Malindi, where I am, at the beach, not very far from where I am speaking, where elders would sit together in a circle under a tree and speak frankly and candidly about the issues of their time. We've held several Buntwani sessions in person over the years. We've had one in Kenya, one in Tanzania, in South Africa, in Ghana. And because of the challenges of COVID, this one is going to be virtual. But I still call upon you today to consider this space a circle. It's a space of equal minds that have something to talk about. We ask you to be candid, to be incisive, to be provocative as much as possible. Now, I know today the civil society organizations present who may feel a little queasy about saying something frankly to funders. And we know that the funders, some funders are very sensitive about things that are said about them. So what we'd ask here today is that we all take on the spirit of just being straight with each other and speaking as openly as possible. And let's not take anything to heart, so to speak. We ask that today we address ourselves plainly to the issues of our times in a way that stimulates us to act individually, but also to stimulate us to collaborate with each other. The belief that we have held since 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals were first launched, is that their achievement can only or can best be achieved from the hyper-local level upwards, from village, village by village, county by county, and upwards. We've made a lot of progress these past 5 years, but really, when you think about it, not nearly enough. There are far too many people who are still left behind, and many to such a high margin as we may as well consider them non-existent. Young people in Africa have such apathy that has incapacitated them and made them increasingly prone to violence, and COVID has not helped. The civil society has a role to play, as do the funders who support them. We're here today to ask the question, what does it in fact take to enable CSOs to better support communities at their point of need? What should funders know about the contexts that CSOs are working with? What should we know about what funders are having to deal with? And what would it take for funders to provide more flexible funding? For this and more, we have a lively group of speakers. And to start us off, I'm going to invite Rose Maroro to set us up with some context about the civil society. They did some wonderful research over the past year or so about how COVID has impacted civil society organizations. Then after that, we shall have Chris Karinki, who will tell us stories from the ground before we get to the first panel. So before without any further ado, I'm going to invite Rose to come on. She has about 10 minutes to talk to us, and then after that, we'll have Chris. So Rose, if you're here, let's go.
Yes, hi, Kags. Yes, I'm here indeed. Speaking to you from Dakar. It's about 2 o'clock here now. So it's a very good time for me. So thank you for inviting me, and really glad to be here and to see some familiar names, and really looking forward to this discussion, which is very rare, I think, in our sector. So I have very little time, so let me jump right into my presentation. And I guess in keeping with Buntwani, it's an unpresentation, so I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to speak through some of the key findings from our report on the impact of COVID on African civil society organizations. And the report I'm presenting today is actually the second one by EPIC Africa, the organization that I run, and at African NGOs, that's run by the partner with whom we did this, David Barnard, who I believe is also participating. So our first report captured the impact, the very early impact of the pandemic. And so we wanted to see how the sector has fared almost a year and a half later. That's why we did the second survey and this, subsequent report. We wanted to compare regions and countries, which we hadn't done in our first report, as well as sectors, to see if some had fared better or worse than others. Now, our first report was based on a survey of about 1,015 organizations that came from 44 countries. This second one is based on a similar sample of 1,039 organizations, but this time we have 2 more countries, so they're from 46 countries. And we conducted this survey in June and July of this year. But along with the CSO survey, we also carried out a mini survey of 26 funders of African CSOs to see how they themselves were being impacted by COVID-19 and what implications that impact had or was expected to continue having on the CSOs that they fund. Now, our report contains many important, interesting, worrying, but also encouraging findings. And I hope you've all read it or will read it after this. But in keeping with the focus of today's discussions, I'm just really going to very narrowly focus on the impact on CSO funding, particularly from institutional funders who are primarily foreign private foundations. So when I say funders, most specifically referring to those types of funders. So the first and most critical finding was that the funding situation had worsened from the situation in 2020. So we found that 68.1% of respondents said that they had lost some funding since the pandemic. And this was an increase of about 12.5% over this, the number in 2020. Now, the loss of funding was most widespread among CSOs with smaller budgets, particularly those that have, about 100, have 100,000 or less US dollars. And here we saw that 73.7% of them said that they had lost some funding. Now, while still significant, the loss of funding among respondents with budget expenditures over 1 million was less widespread. For example, only 40% of CSOs with budget expenditures between 5 to 10 million US dollars said that they had lost funding. But 40% is still significant. So I'm just using the word only in quotes and in comparison. Now, when we ask CSOs to predict the changes in funding trends in the next 12 months, close, again, over 50%, in fact, 57.2% predicted that funding would continue to decrease. And if the situation didn't change, 5.1% said that they would actually cease to exist. They would close down altogether. Now, the loss of funding was happening at the same time as operating costs were rising. And in fact, 45% of the respondents said that costs had increased. by 10% compared to 2020. Concurrently, CSOs were experiencing an increased demand on the services that they provide. In fact, an increase of about 10% since 2020. Now, despite the fact that CSOs are sometimes the sole providers of services that fill gaps in government provided services, only 8.4% reported getting any government funding in response to COVID-19. And as some of you will remember, in many of our countries, there were national COVID funds, and there was a lot of concern and efforts to save the private sector, but only 8.4% of CSOs actually got any money. Nobody talked about saving the civil society sector. Internally, organizations were also confronted with new challenges, the most striking of which was around staff wellness, and really, really high numbers, 87% of CSOs saying that there was increased anxiety and stress levels among their staff, increased pressure and workloads on executive leadership as well. And if I recall well, it's about 37% said that one or more of their staff had actually fallen ill with COVID. So the impact experienced by CSOs, again, not surprisingly, had a cascading effect on the populations and issues that they focus on. And when we asked them to describe this effect, respondents painted a worsening situation. They described examples of children and adolescents whom they serve being denied vital services such as education programs that they used to run, life-saving medication for HIV positive people, shelter for victims of domestic violence, and very importantly as well, the muting of citizens' voices on critical matters that directly affected their lives. For example, increased police brutality as states impose COVID-19 containment measures. Now, what is rather remarkable in this rather bleak story is, of course, the perennial resilience of African civil society, because despite daunting challenges, 80%, actually over 80% of those surveyed reported that they had actually introduced new COVID-related activities. Many organizations were able to respond through donations by individuals. Another remarkable finding from our survey and further evidence perhaps of the invisibility of not only African CSOs, but also of African agency and giving. Another remarkable finding is that COVID-19 forced some funders to become more flexible and understanding in their grant-making practices. In fact, our mini survey of 26 funders revealed that many had relaxed reporting obligations, converted project-based funding to operational funding, and listened to their grantees as to where and how to best support them during this uncertain and challenging period. So to conclude on our findings, our data show a direct link between the size of budget expenditures and the ability of civil society organizations to weather the impact of COVID-19 on their operations. But the historical underfinancing of African CSOs has made the sector extremely vulnerable to external shocks. It has also starved CSOs of resources that they need to build robust organizational structures that can help to withstand external crises. So money matters a lot. And it is not just the level of funding that is important. The type and structure of funding, its duration, its purpose, its predictability, all these things matter. And unfortunately, most funding to African CSOs has tended to be short-term and project-specific. And this has meant that African CSOs are hard-pressed to demonstrate impact as their activities lack continuity and are constantly changing focus in response to donor priorities, leaving behind few tangible long-term outcomes. Unable to sustain programs and to build track record of achievement, CSOs often find themselves with a credibility deficit, even among those they exist to serve. So when we asked CSOs and funders, how can funders best contribute to the sector's recovery and future-proofing? And not surprisingly, or maybe surprisingly, they were quite in agreement, echoing the same solutions, that are quite well known. So we had that, funders must be flexible, they need to give long-term institutional grants, There must be more trusting of African CSOs, more sharing of power. They must fund African CSOs directly. They must support and work through networks. And they must support institution building, including strengthening local infrastructure for philanthropy. And so if there's nothing new in terms of the things that funders should do, where are we? And yet they're not, some are doing it, not enough of them are doing it, maybe that's how to put it. Where are we finding the glimmer of optimism that the title of our report alludes to? Where are we finding hope in the moment? Where we're finding hope is in the moment that we inhabit. And what is new and unique about this moment is that COVID-19 has shown that change is actually possible. What do I mean? First, many funders, as I just described, have demonstrated unprecedented flexibility. Many also provided additional resources. And these steps were quite unimaginable for many before the pandemic. Now, whether these changes will stay or will not is still unclear. In fact, among the 26 funders who we surveyed, almost 50% thought that these changes were going to be temporary, while another 20% were not sure what would happen. Still, we are finding inspiration from funders who are showing the way. And here I would like to just quickly read to you the words of one of the funders who participated in our survey to show actually what is possible. And they say that this is not a new lesson, but the importance of flexible general support was reaffirmed over the course of our grant making in 2020. Multi-year flexible grants gave many of our partners the space to react to changing situations. Additionally, we learned that it's important for grant duration to be set up by partners and not to be limited to our grant-making cycles. We are doubling down on providing multi-year support to our partners, including both existing and new partners. We are also recommending more and flexible time for reporting after the implementation of a grant, without waiting to invite a grantee for a renewal grant after the official closeout of the first grant. Finally, this past year has highlighted the importance of investing in infrastructure to enable partners to adjust their work style and plans as needed. For example, a number of partners work from desktops and didn't have laptops to take home to continue their work. Partners benefit from having additional funds to build out their infrastructure so they can remain resilient in changing environments. That's a dream funder, right? Now, the second place where we are finding hope is in the response from African CSOs themselves. As I said, despite daunting challenges, they have demonstrated that change is possible. We've seen CSOs quickly pivot. We've seen a lot of creativity. In fact, 80% of those surveyed said that they had they had started or initiated new COVID-specific activities. We also saw, really fast adoption of technology and new ways of working. So in this, we see African CSOs exercising agency, and they're acknowledging challenges that are within their power to change. And many of them are beginning to think differently about their operating models. The third place, and then kind of the final place where we are finding hope, and that makes us think this moment is different, is that African CSOs are no longer the lone voice calling for meaningful change in the global aid architecture and practices. Indeed, a constellation of voices, local and global, is growing louder in the call for change. We've seen private and corporate philanthropy, bilateral funders, all seeming to be calling for the same thing. So our question then is, and our hope is that COVID-19 seems to have ignited an inflection point, but the extent to which this hope, and the hope that this moment offers, will be realized, of course, depends on the willingness of those with power. And here, since we're talking about funders, especially funders, to act decisively and quickly to seize this moment and this window. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose. In fact, we're going to be talking a little bit more about that report, so I'm not going to ask you any questions at this particular point. I am going to encourage everyone to make sure that they go onto the EPIC Africa website, which is epic-africa.org, and download that report. so that you can be able to read it. But when you if you have questions for Rose, please make sure you put them up on the chat, and we shall make sure that during the panel we shall pose them to her. For now, I invite Chris Karaoke. Chris is the founder of an organization in Kilifi County. He's going to tell us a little bit more about it, and then he's going to tell us a couple of stories of life on the ground. So Chris, I want to welcome you to switch on your video and unmute yourself so that I can see that you're here and exit. Oh, excellent. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Excellent. It's great to have you here. Please tell us all about your story.
Thank you, Al. My name is Chris Karinki, and the founder and program coordinator of Visions Magnet Theatre. This is a community-based organization in Malindi, Kenya, Kilifi County, to be precise. The organization was formed in 2003 and was registered in 2004 November. And most of our work is behavior change communication, mainly targeting the youth in and out of school. And I thought it's good to share that immediately after registering, we were engaged by an NGO called Path Kenya in formerly a project called Impact Project. And we were part of the implementers of Impact Project in Malindi. And we were talking to the youth in regards to peer education. And we were also doing theater activities. And we would reach the youth and the general community with an aim of, one, ensuring that people access voluntary counseling and testing, because it was mainly about HIV and AIDS and STIs. And part of the success stories we get from the project, and we were part of the implementation from 2003 to 2005, is one, the reduced levels of stigma and discrimination. We could really see people coming out and giving their stories about how they got infected, which was a thing that could not happen initially because of the high levels of stigma. And the voluntary counseling and testing uptake increased because we were working closely with the Ministry of Health, and we could report both to the NGO and to the Ministry of Health. And more than that, there was increased knowledge and capacity built amongst the young people, because the dramas were done by the youth out of school, even though they aimed to reach youth in school and youth out of school. After 2005, that was the end of the project, and we were left to wait for any other non-governmental organization that would come our way. Then from that time to now, we have worked with different non-governmental organizations on different aspects affecting our community. One thing that Rose has mentioned, which is true, the biggest problem that we have as community-based organizations is that when we are working under a non-governmental organization, it is that organization to come with a plan, and that organization to tell us how to go about it. There is no predictability. We can have a work plan for the next month, and the organization tells us now we know more activities, we are doing evaluation, and the community-based organization will just have to comply. It is for that reason that we wrote a proposal in 2018 to the National AIDS Control Council in Kenya in what we call Total War on AIDS, round 5. And they gave us some money, 350,000 Kenya shillings, to be precise, to implement for 6 months. And we were doing behavior change communications for the youth in school and out of school, targeting positive behavior formation or behavior change for those who had already been influenced into negative behavior. And it worked so well. But again, after 6 months, there was no funding and we had to scale down. So the reason as to why I am very happy to be part of this communication is because we need to have a way in which the funders can work directly with the groups in the community. One of the reasons is we are part of these communities which the funders aim to help because they have very good will. They want to help these communities. We are part of this community. And despite the fact that the funds may be little, we have a moral obligation to ensure that whatever amount comes to the community has to reach the beneficiary for which it was intended. If we don't do that and we are still in this community, we will have a problem with our brothers and sisters and our neighbors. One thing, if you look at my organization, Visions Magnet Theatre, from formation in 2003 to now, I can comfortably say that that is enough experience because we've worked with different organizations, different strategies, different projects. That is enough experience to ascertain that we can also run a project without an intermediary. We can run a project comfortably the moment we do a proposal and it is acceptable by the donor, and the funding comes directly to the organization, and not only Visions Magnet, yet any other CBO that has been in existence for a while. We can run the project so well. In a situation where the fund realizes that there might be some capacity problem, then capacity building can be done, just like it happens in the NGOs. There are several on-job trainings and building of capacity to ensure that these projects are done and done as effectively as the funder will expect. One thing, and one reason as to why I strongly feel that the community-based organizations should be empowered and enabled to work directly in projects affecting the community is that they understand the communities better. Unlike when we bring in somebody who has been brought by the project from a different area, they may not be understanding these people's tradition, culture, and sometimes religion. And sometimes while implementing the project, we might end up stepping on the shoes of the community which we intend to help, and then we have a negative impact. But if we have the people living there, the community-based organizations implementing the projects, they know what to do when and what is the best timing for whichever project that may come their way. Another thing, reason as to why I feel community-based organizations can effectively implement projects if funded directly is because of project sustainability. The moment the funding comes to a community-based organization, these people are known in the community, and when they call for a stakeholders meeting, from the first stakeholder meeting, there is that ownership of that project, because the ones who are sitting on the side of the CBO and the other stakeholders are people who have known each other long before this particular project. And there is that trust, that natural trust, because they have worked together even without the funding. And these people will be able to know where exactly to place what amounts of money without exaggerations, without other strategizing meetings that will cost a lot at the cost of that person who is supposed to benefit from this money that has been brought. CBOs like ours already have networks, existing networks, with other CBOs, with the non-governmental organizations within our areas, and with the relevant government departments. Like us, we work very closely with the Ministry of Health, we work very closely with the Ministry of Education. And therefore, if funding comes to an organization like ours, we will not have to convince these offices who we are and what we intend to do. They already know who we are. The most we can tell them is that we have gotten this funding, and we can work together to ensure that this funding does the best in this particular community. And I'm sure it can be very, very, very easy because one, we already have the community trust. We don't need to look for it. And two, those people in the offices already know us because in a small way, we can never wind up our offices. We still continue implementing, but at a very small scale. That is why we would really ask for funding so that we scale up and reach as many people as possible. In a situation where there is somebody between us and the funder, the best that can happen for effective implementation is involving the CBOs that will sub-implement the project from the planning process. Because our areas are so dynamic. You can, whatever you find in Malindi town, for example, is completely different from what you will find in a place like Garashi, which is still in the wider Malindi and Kilifi County. So the moment you involve us from the planning, then we can be able to tell you what is workable in what area and what is not workable in a particular area. So in a situation where the funds does not come directly to the CBO, then whoever will receive the fund should include the CBO leaders or the CBOs from the planning point, not the implementation only. Because sometimes we are involved in implementation. We don't know where the project will end. We don't know what the next move will be. We just told you're supposed to do this for this duration and this is the amount, which sometimes we feel is unfair because even most of the people who are working in these NGOs are people we have grown up with, are people we have mentored, and they have gotten those positions as project officers. So we believe that with such funding, we can also be able to implement effectively because we also need to please the communities from which we come and the communities within which our offices are located. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a very powerful, treatise on why we should be working at the most local levels in our communities, and why it is that resources should actually percolate downwards all the way to the community. I know, Chris, we shall be asking you a lot of interesting questions as we go. Please, if you have questions for Chris, do put them up on the chat. Right now, what we shall do is that we shall prepare ourselves to go into our first panel conversation. In our first panel, we shall be having some very good people that we are excited to be having. They include Giesi Karuri Sevina, who is the coordinator of Civitech Innovation Africa at the University of Witwatersrand. They include Grace Mainge, who is the CEO of KCDF. Rose, who you have already met, is going to be coming in, and we shall also co-opt Chris at some point in the conversation we shall be having. But first, we have a video that was prepared for your edification. So as we end that video, I'm going to invite Geshi, Grace, Rose to please put on their videos and get ready for the chat. But for now, let's play that video first.
To the citizens. This was a milestone in the right direction, as we have often believed that real change happens where data and development meets real people. We believe that sustainable development can best be achieved at subnational level, village by village, county by county, province by province. Governments also have a mandate to provide services and equitably allocate resources to their communities. What we have found through our work is that data is crucial to this end. For the government to deliver services, they must have numbers. For them to have numbers, they must engage citizens. We take the leave no one behind mantra seriously. This has greatly fueled the work that we do to find and give voice to people who are left behind, using data for improved advocacy and agency. These include artisanal small-scale miners who eke out a living working without safety gear or equipment and often getting raw deals for their precious metals and stones that they mine. We aim to make every ASM be counted and their needs and prioritized, amplified into action by government and other stakeholders. Persons with disabilities are often left out, especially in as far as accessibility is concerned. We have asked ourselves, could a person with disability come from one end of town to another independently and with dignity? What are the things that must happen to enable them? These thoughts inspired the Ability Project that mapped out every street in Nairobi and several other towns. Those maps are used as tools for advocacy. We have been privileged to work with county governments, collaborating with them to collect, analyze, and build the capacity of their data offices. Through our Open County program, we have worked with several counties to promote open government at the grassroots. Most recently, we have engaged 10 data leaders, county chief officers, who have been part of our Data Leaders Fellowship program. We have been working with these data fellows to strengthen their county's data value chains with the goal of setting up county statistical units to manage county data. At the heart of our work is our collaboration with various partners and experts, from our fellow CSOs to development partners and governments. We keep working together to realize a dream of a prosperous continent with continuous improved livelihoods for their citizens and that sustains its own development.
Thank you very much there for that wonderful video. And now I'm happy to invite to join me for this first panel, Geshi Karuri Sabina, Grace Mainge, and Rose Maroro to switch on the videos and come closer so that we can have a bit of a conversation with each other. Because of the fact that the spirit of Buntwani is such that we are very egalitarian in our approach, we are going to stipulate that these ladies and all of you attending are fairly accomplished people in your respective places. If anybody wants to read the profiles of these wonderful ladies, please go onto the WOVA platform and read there. I'm not going to read about their PhDs. I'm not going to talk about their great qualifications. I'm just going to address them by their first name so that we are as informal and egalitarian as possible, with your permission, all three of you. And so the thing that we're here to talk about is that we all represent civil society organizations. Grace, you represent an organization that is a grant maker that is supporting organizations like Chris's. Geshi, you have been at the forefront of thinking about civic tech in Africa. I have attended a number of events that you have organized, and I've seen the kind of level of conversation that we're having there. And we've already seen the kind of work that Rose is doing. So the conversation that we're having here is on behalf of the civil society and the challenges that we are facing, especially insofar as two things are concerned. One, how we manage money. And I'm speaking as basic and plainly as possible. How we manage money, how money comes into civil society to help us to do what we are supposed to do. And when I say civil society here, I don't just mean the large organizations like KCDF, EPIC, like Open Institute at that level, but I'm also meaning community-based organizations as well. But also one of the questions that many funders are going to be asking is, how do we monitor impact? So we have given $1 billion shillings or $1 billion to organizations across the continent. How do we monitor impact? So I'm going to start with you, Grace, and I'm trying to connect you with what Chris was just talking about here, the need for money to flow all the way down to community-based organizations. And I know that Rose touched on this as well. What is your experience, and what is your initial sort of sense of what you heard from Chris, and how does that resonate to the other organizations that you engage with?
Great, thanks so much for that, and I appreciate all that we have had beforehand. In terms of that, Chris's experience and very many others, how does money get to where it's really needed to do the work intact, without it having broken down too much or being used too much further up the stream, is a thing that we all have to really ask ourselves. What are we trying to solve, and how do we want to solve it? Can we be part of the solution, and understanding that it's not only resources that are coming from elsewhere that will solve the problem, but also resources from the community. So how do we be able to appreciate those resources in the community and combining it with what comes from outside? So how do we reduce how do we reduce the money getting spent in administration of grant-making organizations, different other organizations that are the intermediaries? The only way we can do that is that if we have an honest conversation about what are we trying to solve, because then we will reduce our administrative costs higher up and make sure that a bulk of that money actually goes to solving the problem. And we will recognize that we cannot solve the problem by throwing money at it only. We have to also involve the community, because the community already has knowledge about how to deal with these issues. The community already has resources they're putting towards this. So how do we not come with a fixed mentality of what we're trying to do? Now, I know you said, let's speak plainly. I've tried to speak as plainly as I can, but you tell me if I'm still wearing my NGO hat too tight. Rome wasn't built in a day, but I think you understand what I'm saying. How do we be focused on dealing with the problem, and that will change our mindset in where the money goes. We'll be more focused on making sure people like Chris have what they require to solve the problem. Yeah.
I see what you're saying, but so the question that I would have for you now is to say, so when we are trying to deal with trying to push down that money all the way down to the ground, isn't there a challenge that we have to balance between the cost of grant making and because of the fact that it becomes very difficult for one grant maker to issue 100 or 1,000 grants, small grants especially, to as many people as possible. And the motivation for many funders is to say, well, I'd rather give one major grant. It is easier for I think Luminate is here. It's easier for Stan at Luminate to give one major grant to KCDF so that KCDF can go ahead and distribute that money than for them to actually do the work of the distribution from San Francisco. What is your experience with regard to how that cost is managed and how that can be mitigated so that we can push that admin cost down?
So how to manage that cost and how to mitigate that is what I'm talking about, clarity in terms of what are we trying to solve, what will it take to solve that, so that then even in terms of what actually ends up at the community level is commensurate with what we have seen will come to solve it. And then as we move up in terms of how do we manage multiple grants and, avoid one organization having to deal with multiple grants that they have to do. Now the economies of scale comes in there, and agreeing that if we're going to do that, what does it take also for the grant maker to be able to undertake that in an effective manner? So the conversation has to start backwards, as opposed to how we start the conversation from the funder to the grant maker to the community organization. The conversation has to start from the community organization. This is what we need to solve the problem. Speaking with the grant maker, this is the problem we have. This is what we need to do it. Okay, if we're working together on this, what is then my cost coming in terms of, if I'm working with you around capacity development, if I'm working with you in terms of networks across different counties. So the economies of scale has to be the conversation. And then we go into the funder and saying, look, we have this great idea. We think we can be able to chip away at this problem. This is what it's going to cost. But right now, the conversation is the other way around. The funder coming and saying, there's this problem. This is how much you're going to get. This is how you're going to solve it. So that's what I'm talking about. How do we have the conversation from the other way? Because that will enable us to mitigate and manage those costs. Yeah.
That's extremely useful. I want to turn now to Geshi for a moment. And Geshi, I want to ask you about exactly where Grace has left off, the whole idea about listening and how we listen so that we can better design projects. Now, one of the places where projects have been designed almost perennially with pilot projects is in the civic tech space, where you find that there's a lot of identification of a problem, building something that hopes to solve the problem, and then abandoning that and going to build something else. Could you talk a little bit about the nature of listening to problems from the communities and how solutions then are arrived at?
Yeah, no, thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me. I hope the audio is clear. So I really would pick up from exactly what Grace was just saying, because I do think a lot of this has to do, and what we are hearing from our stakeholders, is it does have a lot to do with, if you want, perhaps the cart is driving the horse. You end up having people doing what the funders are willing to fund instead of getting funding for what is needed. So if what a funder wants to do, and of course, tech is the new game in town. So in our space, anybody who's doing anything that sounds like it's innovation, fourth industrial revolution, digital transformation, you don't even need to understand what it is, but it's going to attract some interest. However, even often those, I mean, the good civic tech organizations, even those organizations often will be able, if you ask them, if you listen, to tell you probably what you should really fund is this, that, or the other. But we've gotten very good, especially as small organizations, and many of them are small organizations, at parading. And the burden of parading is high, because the burden of parading is about making sure your proposal sounds like exactly what the funder is saying. Even if you feel you know something more or different from what the funder is saying, that's not often really entertained, especially if perhaps there is no proof of concept of the issue you're raising, and you have no capacity to fund developing proof yourself. And sometimes that proof has to be at a reasonable scale. So sometimes it's not something you can cook in the office to show them that it's possible. It's something you do need significant funding. And this is where trust comes in. So I think it's the listening, but it's the trust that goes with it as well. I think there are a lot of onerous and sometimes oppressive demands that funders often, I think, maybe inadvertently, and maybe it's also just inertia. The system has always done things that way, because, I think many funders are subject to their own bureaucracies and challenges as well. But what we're hearing from the fundee side is, yes, listen to us, understand that we don't always need to develop something new. Sometimes we're a tech organization, but the specific issue does not require a tech solution. Actually, could you fund us to do something that's not tech, even though you want to say you're funding tech? And these things, I think, is where nuance comes in and where the listening becomes very important.
That you're speaking to Jay's heart as you talk about this right now, because I remember that in the early days we used to get so frustrated by this idea where a person gets maybe $500,000 for building an app, I'll give you a specific example that is in my mind right now. Somebody built an app a few years ago that that was supposed to help us with voting. All that the app really did was to do a directory of voting stations. But what they then did is that when they went to present the app at an international conference, they put a picture of a long line of voters that we had in Kenya that year, and said that because of their app, we had these lines. People knew where to go and vote, and therefore people voted like this. And what was interesting is just out of that, they got a ridiculous amount of money to continue the work of that app. And you find that the actual work of building the app and the actual work of building the tech is not commensurate. So I know wherever Jay is right now, he feels you very, very strongly. And that question of parading is one that I almost want to bring Rose into a little bit. Rose, when you're doing your research, did you spend any amount of time thinking about sort of both this year and last year? Did you spend any amount of time thinking about impact and how listening is done and how proof of concepts are designed and how projects are designed, you know, for that sustainability to continue? Because even as we are talking about funding during COVID, you realize that some of those funds could not be sustainable during COVID simply because of how they were designed. And majority of the programs are designed out of San Francisco. So would you have any comments or any lessons that you picked up around that?
Wow, that's a difficult question. I guess maybe the simple answer is yes and no. And the no mostly because part of the big challenge of even talking about impact or measuring impact or showing impact is that there's just such a dearth of data. Like, you know, there's a lot of anecdotal stories which are important, but we just don't know. We just don't know. And if you were to think of the civil society philanthropy space as a sector, rather than individual parts that don't ever seem to add up to a whole, then it's a very sort of dysfunctional market, if you're to use that term. Lots of asymmetry of information and just a lot of inefficiencies. And so it's very difficult sometimes really, even when we attempt to talk about, the African civil society and someone posed a question to us and said, so, okay, so you've surveyed, 1,000+ organizations, like what does that represent in terms of the universe of CSOs? And it's how many CSOs are there? We don't know. What do they do? We can't really say how many work on this area. So it's really difficult. So for me, and as we've thought about data and knowledge building in this space, it's exactly so that we are able to begin to even talk about impact and the collective contribution to something. Aggregating, the question of aggregating. So the efforts that our colleague Chris was talking about with the work that they've done in Malindi, what does that add up to? Are there another 1,000 that have done that? And so there's very little really that goes on. Funders tend to, when they do commission evaluations, tend to do it for their own purposes. So it's not something that's out there that then one can go and collate and say, wow, between 2000 and 2022, this is the amount that has come in to do HIV. This is where we were. It's just very, very difficult. So one of the things that then we're trying to do is becoming real evangelists about this need for more and better data, so we can really begin to aggregate and just see what is going on in this sector. So that's sort of my long answer. And I think it's really important to also start to think of this space as an ecosystem and with different, with all of us sort of in different parts of it, but feeding into each other and drawing from each other. But right now the ecosystem is very broken. It's really difficult. So as we think, what should funders do? What should CSOs do, etc. I think for me, even as we continue to obviously respond to urgent problems, I think there has to be the work of infrastructure building. And that just has to accompany whatever else we're doing in terms of programs. I hope I answered your question. Maybe I asked more.
I think you did go a long way in answering it, and I can see Grace agreeing fervently with it. And Grace, as you agree with Rose, I want to ask you to talk about how do you, I mean, you're already funding hundreds of organizations, hundreds of civil community-based organizations. How do you track impact? How do you do the listening? What are the sort of things that you do to listen to all those many voices and figure out whether or not you're making impact on a particular issue?
So how we track impact and how we are able to see what's coming out from that, it's very important for us to be able to see what are the common threads, what are the common issues, what are the big things that we're hearing over and over again. So how we do that simply is, through our monitoring process. What that simply means is visiting the partners, listening to them in terms of where they're at, listening to the people they've been working with, how the work has impacted them, what has challenged them, what has changed, and listening not from a point of, so here's the results framework, you were to plant 100 trees, you didn't plant 100 trees, so there's failure, but you were to plant 100 trees, you're saying you only managed to plant 10, what happened to the other 90? And there's always a story behind what happened to the other 90 that then is able to light that bulb in terms of, we need to rejig this. This isn't working. We need to do this differently. And so at times you'll be able to start seeing the map in terms of exactly what Chris was saying. This particular project can work very well in this part of the country, and it will fail dismally in another part of a country. And being able to understand that doesn't mean the project is a failure. It just means it's a representation of how we really are as society. Society, we're not all the same. We are all different in even in a village, in an estate, in a community, in a country. And so our programming has to also be conscious of that. So being able just to listen and listen from a non-judgmental way, even when our partners will tell us, you're not responsive to us. We ask you this, you don't respond. Being able to take it and say, yeah, actually, we didn't do that and we must do better. So when you don't have that pressure of, I have to show that we planted 10,000 trees all around the country, that's when you're able to get the real gems in terms of what's happening in society. Yeah.
Jesse, can I just turn to you right now and ask you a question that maybe I should have asked at the beginning, but it's just occurred to me that I must ask this question. There are funders in this room right now, and I would very much like to ask you directly, what is it that they should know, but we are often afraid of saying to them? What is this big thing that we would love funders to know about the work that we do, that most of our people within our community find it difficult to voice?
Yeah. So probably the most difficult one, and I can say this because we are sort of a network, even though we are also funded, but hopefully there's minimal damage I'll do to myself, so I can say it, is that often what grantees need from funders is funding. It may sound obvious, but on the one hand, I think it's wonderful that philanthropy has really tried to grow itself into being more nurturing, more holistic. And so from the beginning, wanting to be part of, specifying and being part of the design, wanting to walk the journey with you, wanting to do detailed M&E, all of these things are wonderful. The reality is the most important ecosystem for any organization, and I talk about civic tech organizations, but I think it's true for others as well, is the ecosystems there in themselves. Now, the funder is perhaps a visitor in those ecosystems, but the things that really affect what you're doing are the communities you're working with, the government you're working with, the people who live around there. There's a whole other ecosystem of which I think the philanthropist often is a transient member, but there are many people who are a permanent part and can make life very difficult. And that's often the ecosystem that matters most. And let me include, by the way, formal knowledge institutions, because we often don't include those. I'm talking about your universities, your colleges, your academics, and often we don't see those as part of the ecosystem, and we must begin seeing them as part of that ecosystem. I think it's very difficult sometimes for grantees to say that, look, if you could perhaps focus more on funding and less on trying to curate a space that in fact we are better positioned to curate. I think that's something that's difficult to say. I think another one that's difficult to say is that the metrics you're using may not be the best for us. So, you know, we like talking about whether it's impact, and I like the comments that were just made, or sustainability. These things are not, there's no universal definition to them. Context is everything. Context matters, and that local knowledge matters. And if nothing else, maybe think of, sorry, there's a big storm starting here. So I hope you're not hearing all the noise around me.
No.
Okay, good. So I think that's also difficult for people to say that, that yes, we do understand, and we're not trying to be unaccountable, but could you also consider that perhaps the metrics you're using and the things that are of concern to you are perhaps not quite the same in our context, and we're not just trying. And maybe I'll add a third one, which I think is quite an important one. I was part of a project recently, actually a study on philanthropy in the humanitarian space, and I was very surprised to see one chart that showed that international respondents to the survey that we were doing indicated that it was more important to have governance, good governance and accountability than it was to achieve the outcomes of the program. Now, to me, that's very telling that we've somehow created and, you know, colluded into creating a space where people actually begin to believe that the hygiene of the work is more important than whether you're actually achieving anything. To me, that's very scary. And I think it may be difficult for people to say that, look, your requirements are too onerous. We understand the need for M&E, but now we're spending all our time writing reports, doing this, doing that, and never actually being able to commit to the detail of the work that needs to be done. And some of that is not measurable. Some of that are things that don't add up to these metrics you want to focus on. And it's not that we're trying to be unaccountable for the funding, but it doesn't make sense for 80% of the organization to be focused on that and not on the work we're supposed to be doing. So those would be three. I can give you more, but yeah, there are many things I think we might be scared to say to our funders.
We should actually, you know, create a complete session for just that particular conversation, because it is a valuable one, and I know that Stan is taking notes copiously right now, thinking about these things that we're saying. But you know, there are different kinds of funders that we have sort of you know, we constantly address ourselves to, and for many of them, the question of flexibility is an important one. The fact that some funders will give you the money and then allow you to pivot or change the direction of the how that money is spent, or even the timelines of how that money is going to be spent based on what the situation is on the ground. One of the things that I remember us having a conversation with a funder who we once proposed to is, if we go to a farming community and we want to have a meeting with them, one of those, what Chris was calling a stakeholder workshop or a stakeholder meeting. If we go there and we want to have a conversation with them, but it rained yesterday, a farmer is not going to fail to go to the farm and come to the social hall to listen to you. First, they will go to the farm and then reschedule your meeting for later, because that's just how the nature of things are. But then if I'm very straitjacketed by the way the program is structured, then, you know, it becomes very difficult for me to do that. And I'm forced to cobble up some kind of report so that I can perform, which you are calling parading. What is the capacity, Rose, of civil society organizations, in your experience, and I'm putting you on the spot here, what do you think is the capacity of civil society organizations to say no to money? To say, well, the way that we want to do this and the way that you guys want us to do this doesn't align, so keep your money as we're going to continue doing things differently, or we'll find somebody who can support us the way we want to be supported.
Wow, that's a really tough one. That's like suicidal, right? So it has happened. I mean, I think having that clarity of mission and having that level of agency, and I think it's what can allow an organization to say no. And yeah, just and being strategic too. I mean, if you may say yes to something that's short term because you see it as a step to something. So to me, I think it's a very nuanced, sort of a very nuanced decision, because sometimes it's like choosing your battles, right? I mean,
right.
As long as for me it's not harmful, then that's fine. But clearly there's some funding that can be very harmful. But oftentimes I think organizations feel that they're not, like they don't have I don't want to say the right, that they can't say no. But I think there's also respect that comes from saying no. Like, you know what, you absolutely know what you're doing. And being clear about why it is a no. So I think for me, one of the things that I'd love to see and hope to see, and I think you mentioned words like that, words about dignity, about agency, and just being clear, why do we exist? You know, and what is our theory of change? You know, the change that we want to see. How do we believe it happens actually? So if a funder is asking you to do something, a project for 1 year, and then they start asking you about impact, how can you have impact in 1 year? So already, I mean, that's a reason to say no. Because if you say yes, clearly it's not possible to show impact. And I think, and maybe this is a challenge to our sector, to civil society, because there are things that we can do, is also just to evolve, you know, our own. So we tend to be reactive, and I hope I can say that without, you know, we tend to be reactive. So that the funder did this, you know, we do have agency, right? And I'd like to see more sort of our own sort of, yeah, ideas of also how change happens. So when a funder comes to me, we're having a conversation. I'm not reacting to what they're telling me necessarily and thinking, oh, that's not possible, but I'll say yes because I need the money. But I think we can also push for those honest conversations. But I think it takes, yeah, it's not as easy as I'm making it sound. But I've been in situations like that. I mean, I just one little anecdote, you know, everybody knows how hard it is to work with USAID, and and I remember very early in my career, I was working in the Gambia for an international NGO, and fortunately they had unrestricted money they did sponsorship, so there was a pot of unrestricted money that you could do whatever you wanted to do with, and we used it to. It was those days when the rapid, what are they called? PRAs, rapid appraisals. So you go to a village and you walk through and, you know, map resources and what have you. And in several villages in the part of the Gambia where we worked, the women consistently said that, you know, they had lost their rice fields to salt infiltration, and could we help them, you know, recuperate those lands? So we said yes, because we had some money to do it, you know, free money. And one of the big problems now was finding the equipment. So I spent like 2 weeks trying to find a case digger in all of Gambia. There was one. Anyway, so we did it. The next rainy season in those villages, women were able to grow rice and were, of course, very happy. So USAID had wind of it, and they wanted us to now do that as a, you know, kind of proper pilot with some sort of operational research type of framework, so they could actually see whether this thing works. But they had conditions, and one of those conditions was, no, first of all, they were very worried that whether wasn't this now creating more work for the women, but it's the women who said this is what they wanted. So it's like, that's what they want. So anyway, we did it, and we got money to do a pilot. And they wanted now for us to have a different reporting system for the $100,000 that they gave us for 1 year. And we were like, at least I had a boss who I guess was empowered enough or felt empowered enough to say, hey, listen, you know, we already have a financial system that meets international standards. We get audited every year by Deloitte, which is an internationally recognized firm. If you want something different, then you have to pay for it. But we can't get our guy, our accountant, to now start setting up another system here to report just to you. And we pushed back and they were okay. They said, okay, we'll accept your financial reports that you send to everybody else. So I think you can say no, but it's not no for the sake of saying no. It's also offering, okay, instead of doing that, this is another alternative that still meets your goal. So I think for me, it's those kind of conversations that need to be happening.
Do you have anecdotes like this, Grace, where you in the various organizations you've worked for, you've got the ability or the hotspots to be able to say no to funding, and what was the impact of that?
Luckily, yes, I've had the ability and the opportunity to say no. Even more recently, where I used to work, I said no to KCDF for a grant because the grant was too small, and told them, no, actually, why don't you take the money and work with somebody else? Similar to what Rose has said previously, where I've worked, because we had a clear reporting template that we wanted to report to all our funders, and we were operating a basket approach. And we said, join the basket or please don't join the basket. And because, again, we have a reporting template that everyone has agreed to. It's up to international standards, even though we were a local organization audited, by a tier 1 audit firm. So that was acceptable. But what I want to add to what Rose has said is that it's very difficult to have that agency if you don't have a backup plan. So the board would not be amused if I said no to funding if we're going to be out of funding in a couple of months. So for me, and even into Chris's story, my biggest request to funders always is help us get our own money, help us get our own money. Then we'll be able to do what we really care about, which you will see the results like in the anecdote that Rose has shared, and then come along with us. But it's very hard to say no when you don't have a backup plan. Yeah.
And I'm going to stay with you and just ask you, what is the way that you work to build organizations like Chris's so that they actually move up the food chain, as it were?
So it's very important because for them to be able to attract resources from larger funders, they have to have systems in place. That's what funders are looking for. Your accounting system, your reporting systems, your, some sort of stability in terms of your staffing. So they have to have that base. So capacity, working alongside to build those systems. But very important, having the conversation of what resources do you have within the community that you can lean into to take you through lean times. And Chris spoke to that. At times they don't have project funding, but they can still operate. Someone will donate a room for them to have their office out of, cost that as our own contribution to the growth of the organization. Very, very key. And then being able to see how much social capital do you have, and documenting and quantifying the social capital, getting the communities to say, we're going to volunteer, you're going to volunteer a person who will come and do your books of accounts, once a month, just to take you through some of these issues. Being able to build on that. That's so important to then get them to the next level where they are viewed as, less risky, because it's a risk conversation, but also in terms of their different standard processes that are going on in Kenya. There's Viwango certification, showing that someone has standards. This is self-driven, participatory. So there are also those modalities that different civil society organizations have put in place to be able to demonstrate to funders that this organization is at this level. One thing I want to say is that we don't all have to be large, national NGOs. We can do great things. And I really respect some organizations that tell us we have no desire to grow further than 10 staff. We're here, we're doing this, we're happy, we're satisfied. So we must change that mindset that we all need to be big. We all need to have offices across the country. Yeah, thanks.
So the whole conglomeration approach to organizations is something that we have to address ourselves. But I guess it is actually driven also by our need to also own Land Rovers and big houses and so on and so forth. Because even within the civil society, we are still, there's many of us that are still capitalists in how we approach life. And even though we use social language, but and sometimes that language is so, I mean, sometimes we do use words that you wonder, because of the fact that we say words that don't make sense, even to say the simplest of things. I think this is a good place for us to call it. It's 16 past the hour, and I want to thank all of you very much for spending that time. And please stick around, because of the fact that the funders are going to have their say in a short while. And when they do, we need to be there to keep them on their toes as much as possible. If you have questions, we are open to questions. I'm just going to ask the team to shed light if there are any questions that are very burning that were shared, either on WOVA or over here. I'm seeing Jay typing, so that he can be able to tell me this. If there's anything that is, waiting, that is very burning. But I do see that there's a question here that says, I wish funders knew just how important capacity development support, including non-financial, is for grantees with every cycle of funding, both for the short and the long term. And I think that we've addressed extremely well in this session. So the question that I think is burning, and I'm gonna allow both Geshe and Grace to respond to this one, is the whole question of why not fund consortium at subnational levels? That's a question from Chris Owala. He asked, why not fund consortiums at subnational levels? What is your view, Geshe? And then I'll go to Grace.
So sorry, in my context, that would need a bit of context to understand what that would mean, funding consortia at subnational level. I'm not so sure.
So, we were talking, for example, about community, based organizations. What is the opportunity for us to actually fund a consortium of them to do one specific project? So Chris was talking about working in Malindi, in Karachi, and a few other places. What if you were to support organizations like that? Or even in your case, what if you were to support a consortia of small innovators to try and do something together, even if they are, going to be achieving different results of the same coin?
Yeah. So in my context, which is the tech space, I think if that was a bottom-up interest to do it, it would make wonderful sense, because forced marriages don't work very well in this kind of space. And maybe I think there's some fields perhaps where people can maybe be coerced into working together, but there's some areas where things are quite, it's how you see things, your philosophy of whether it's coding or how you see a particular issue. You can't force people to work together. But I do think we're seeing more and more partnerships, even in our context here. And whether it's partnerships at a subnational level or whether it's even organizations in a few different countries teaming up together across Africa, for example, to recognize that together they can go for a type of funding. I don't know how the funders feel about it, but I certainly from the NPO side, I'm seeing a lot of interest in doing that kind of work. People are coming to places like this, not just to meet funders, but to meet peers who are doing interesting work because they want to work with them. So for me, I think it sounds like a viable idea if the interest is from the organizations themselves, not if they're being forced to do it.
That's forced marriages don't work very well. Grace, do you have an opinion on this one?
Yes, very similar. You can't force people to work together. That doesn't even work in normal society. So it's for whose benefit? We must always ask ourselves, we want to fund at subnational level for whose benefit? Who has asked for it? Who does it work in the best interest of? It's better if people have come together or they see the value of coming together, and then, that's how it germinates. But saying everyone gather around, come and I'm going to fund you collectively. People at different levels have different interests. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's brilliant, sometimes it doesn't. So you must ask yourself, in whose interest is this? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the time that we have spent so far. We're going to move on with the program a little bit, and the person that is going to be coming up next is somebody who of whom I am a big fan. I have in recent years been greatly seduced by the idea of shifting the power from just kind of these things that we're talking about in our sector, but across the board. How do we shift the power so that Africans at local level have more power to decide the direction that their development goes in? How do we decolonize some of the attitudes? In one of the blog posts that I recently wrote, I wrote about one of my aunties who has been in this sector for very many years. And she comes from the world where NGOs ask donors, what are you funding? Before they decide what it is that their programming is going to look like. And so Professor Pierre Lumumba is a person of whom I don't think there's anyone in this room does not know who Professor Pierre Lumumba is. I am a big fan of his, and especially of his thinking in recent years about the question of decolonizing our development and decolonizing the way that we think, and finding the African voice and strengthening the African voice so that we can control what our agenda is, even where we need to work with many other people. And so I asked him whether he would come and speak to us for a few minutes about the whole idea of decolonizing development, or decolonizing philanthropy, as it were. And so that we use that as our segue to allowing Stan Getui, who is a principal illuminate, to come with his panel and tell us something new. But Professor Pierre Lumumba, you're a great man, you're a great African, and I am, just like in the previous session, going to refrain myself from reading out your profile.
Thank you.
It is on the Wova for anybody who's interested. But now I'm going to give you the floor to give us some thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, let me say that I've had the advantage of listening to the ladies and gentlemen who have spoken before me. And I want to preface my very brief intervention by reading an excerpt of a book which I commend to all of you. The book is written by a friend of mine who is from Ghana. He is a former lecturer at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana and a traditional ruler. And the title of the book is African Culture in Governance and Development, the Ghana Paradigm. But what I want to preface my intervention with is this quotation, which is found on page 36 of the book, and it reads, permit me to read it. When we look at this African independence explosion, we must take into consideration that not one African nation came to power using a conventional African structure of government. Every one of them used an imitation parliamentary procedure taken from Europe. Africa will never succeed using European parliamentary techniques. And I dare add that after they imitated Europe, they then tried to imitate the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And I think that statement is very important to the approach that I'm going to take about philanthropy. And I dare say that today in Africa, we may talk of something called the philanthropy industry. And I dare say at the very beginning, that despite the best intention of the best Western philanthropy organizations, they have largely contributed into disempowering Africans, and they have contributed into making Africans go into slumber, and they have succeeded in creating what I call a cargo cult mentality amongst Africans, particularly the elite. You will see, for example, that many of these organizations recruit some of our best men and women, and very quickly they reduce them into proposal writing, and very quickly they reduce them into report making, and very quickly they reduce them into attending workshops, seminars, or similar gatherings. And I want to suggest that that is as humiliating as it is disempowering. Many will say that African communities have benefited immensely because of these interventions, but I think not, and I'll demonstrate why. If you look at many African countries, and I travel across Africa to speak with some measure of authority, and I travel in African communities where particularly Western philanthropy organizations and American philanthropy organizations have intervened, either to provide water through boreholes, or to provide health services, or to engage in agriculture, to empower people in agriculture. And there is no shortage of rosy material that they have then disseminated to the world to suggest that but for their intervention, the communities in which they were would be long dead. But my submission is that their interventions have contributed in disempowering those communities. Many of you will remember towards the end of the last century, there was something called the Millennium Villages. And not very far from my rural home, in a place called Barsauri, there was a Millennium Village. It existed and appeared to thrive as long as the donors were there. It was touted as one of the most successful interventions. The name that then came, I think, was a gentleman called Geoffrey Sachs. They talked about how the health sector had improved, how the people had potable water, how women had been empowered, how women had been liberated from using charcoal. Today, that Barsauri is as dead as dodo. It doesn't exist. Because the philosophy that informed that intervention was arrogant. It was based on the assumption that the people did not know what they wanted, and that it is the donors or the funders who knew what was good for them. And indeed, no sooner had they left than their project followed them. And I'm suggesting, as I said at the very outset, I'm now convinced beyond peradventure that the intervention that we see from Western donor organizations will never, ever help Africa. They may appear to do so, but they are purely anodinal. They make you not feel the pain, but ultimately they will ensure that you are incapable of doing the simple things that you can do. I remember a few years ago, I was in an organization which was granted 1 million Kenya shillings by a Swiss organization. When some of the individuals in the organization then gave reports to their Swiss funders, first of all, they proceeded on the assumption that the people who had been given the money were thieves. The questions that they were asked and the manner in which the reporting system was framed was the assumption, these are thieves, and therefore you must keep them on a short leash. And I found that very insulting. And many of you who are in organizations, whether they are NGOs or CBOs, will find that many times donors talk down to you. And even if they don't, the politeness that appears to be the modus operandi of engagement is a mere veneer, which is meant to humanize the relationship, but in their inner hearts, they don't think that you are worthy much. I speak these painful truths because I've seen enough African villages being dehumanized. If you go to the informal sectors, whether they are in Nairobi, Kenya, in Kibera, and you counted the number of interventions that have taken place over the years, or you go to Makoko in Nigeria, in Lagos, or you go to the slums of Luanda in Angola, or you go to the slums in South Africa, there are no shortage of Western funding organizations which have been dealing with the provision of water even for 10 years, within a radius of no more than 2 kilometers, but the problem is never solved. Several years ago, I had the fortune of serving in an organization that made me travel to different parts of Kenya. And I remember in Wajir, an old man came and told us in Kiswahili, "You have also come." And we asked, "Why do you ask that question?" He said, "Many have come. We have seen organizations from America, from Europe, and from different parts of the world. They have come here to sink boreholes. You also have come, but we know that you can never solve our problems. It is only us who must solve our problems." And I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, with all the courage that I can muster this evening, that I'm now convinced that until the day the Africans are capable of funding their basic things, you will always be at the beck and call of Ford Foundation, and I hope they are here, and they are one of the better organizations. You'll always be at the beck and call of Oxfam. You'll always be at the beck and call of USAID. You'll always be at the beck and call of all these organizations, and you know them from Sweden, from Denmark, from Germany, from the United States of America, from the United Kingdom. You know them and you operate with them on a daily basis. Let me tell you, Africa is not going to be changed by them. Our societies are not going to be changed by them. We have to remember that they too have their own agenda, declared or undeclared. I've never understood, for example, when an American organization or a British organization gives a Kenyan organization money, and then they say that your accounts must be audited by a tier 1 accounting firm. Who creates these tier 1 accounting firms? Who determines that a firm is tier 1? Who determines that a firm is international? It is the same organizations. So that in order to qualify for their funding, you must be audited by Ernst & Young. You must be audited by Deloitte and Touche. You must be audited by Price Waterhouse, not Kamau and Githongo, not Onyango and Makoha. No, those are not tier 1 and they can never be tier 1, notwithstanding that they also studied accounts and they are capable of auditing these books. If that is not disempowering, tell me, ladies and gentlemen, what is disempowering? If therefore that is what we call philanthropy, then in my view, that philanthropy is an industry which benefits not us, but them. And I'm suggesting to you that until the day we decolonize the way we do things, I will give a personal example. You may ask, but he's ranting, eloquent, and pontificating. Has he done anything? Yes, I run a foundation which is present in 39 African countries. I've never asked for a single cent from any donor organization, not one, and I will never. How do I fund my activities? From my own resources, I contribute a little, and my friends contribute a little. And I reject funding, whether it is from Ford Foundation or USAID or any other organization, because immediately I accept that funding, I lose my independence, and they begin to control how I run my accounts. They begin to control how I write my reports. They begin to behave like major domos in their relationship to me. It can be done. And we are cutting our coat according to our sizes. Only yesterday, we sent not much money, just $500 to help cultivate an acre of land in Monrovia in Liberia. And it's beginning to work. And I believe that Africa must begin to think like that. $500, $1,000, not $80 million, which is disempowering. So in a nutshell, as I conclude, I am of the considered opinion that we live in a global world, as we are told. But for how long will Africa believe that her very basic problems of water, of food, of sanitation, of education, of health will be solved by other civilizations? For how long? Right now, as I speak to you in a matter that is not related, the IMF and the World Bank have come into Kenya, and they are now telling Kenya, you must close some of your universities. You must restructure your university. It's like somebody going into your house and telling you, you must now do as I say, not as you will. And this is what many of these organizations do. They may deny it, but despite their best intentions, because these organizations also receive monies, and these monies are from taxpayers. The Ford Foundation will receive money from institutions in the United States of America. USAID will receive money from the taxpayers of the United States of America, Oxfam, and all these other organizations, Heinrich Ball, Konrad Adenauer, CEDA, and all these. And those organizations have their own rules. And when they come to Africa, they want to de-Africanize your process and to make them to conform to their own processes. I'm suggesting, as I read at the very outset, the time has come that African institutions must find ways and means of doing their own things. If you are an NGO that has been receiving money from Ford Foundation, you must now begin to think, when will Ford Foundation leave? When will USAID leave? When will Heinrich Ball leave? When will Konrad Adenauer leave? And the sooner they stop funding you, the freer you become. And even if you used to do a million things because of their funding, you'll be much safer if you did only one thing with your funding. That, to me, is what will make Africa begin to realize our potential. Because, ladies and gentlemen, for how long will this happen? For how long will Ford Foundation be present in Africa? For how long? For how long will all these organizations be in Africa doing water, doing HIV, coming to your villages and helping widows, coming to your villages under the 1 acre farm and teaching you how to till land. For how long? And it starts with the mind. And I dare say, at the risk of annoying my colleagues who are here, it is we who have had the advantage of formal, fundamentally Western education who are our own enemies. Our kith and kin in rural Kenya and in formal settlements can't write a proposal. It is we who have become masters at writing proposals. We must learn something else. It is we who have become masters at writing reports whose templates are made in Stockholm or in Copenhagen or in Washington or in London or in some other place. We must unlearn those things. And there is now no shortage of Africans who are capable of engaging in philanthropy. I'm doing a list of Africans who I believe are millionaires in their own rights. And I'm saying that we must now create, and I think it is wise that I conclude so that I can hear the views being brought forth by others. But in concluding, I'm saying, I think, number one, that philanthropy has become an industry. Number two, that philanthropy has created a situation where Africans now suffer from the cargo cult mentality. Number three, I think that philanthropy has disempowered Africa. Number four, I think that the hegemonic nature of Western philanthropy organizations has undermined our capacities. And number five, I think that it has, in a very subtle way, served to enslave us in a manner that we cannot think for ourselves, even in areas that are of a very mundane nature. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to rest it there so that if there is any intervention, I can respond to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. And you know, I just want to sort of ask you a couple of questions that help me to sort of make sense of what it is that you're saying, because logically you make sense. But do you not agree that as Africans, we do not have the mental model of what an African style of development might look like? Because there are not that many stories of African philanthropic activities that we can sort of choose from the, as examples from the formal parts of things. We have philanthropic exercises within our harambes and so on and so forth. But from the formal side of development, we don't have that many billionaires, for example, who have foundations that are doing development or doing water projects and so on and so forth, that we can be able to tell those stories of. And the second thing that I was hoping that you can deal with before we move to the next panel is, because we don't have this mental model, what is it that you think, if you're to give me a cheat sheet, what is it that we do? Because right now we need the money so that we can, that the Western foundations give us, so that then we can develop that agency, so that then we can develop our future the way we want after we have that money. Or are you saying that that's not going to be a model that works? What then do we do differently in terms of practically?
Let me give you an example. About 10, I think perhaps it is 20 years ago, I used to belong to an organization which was East African Grant Makers Association. And the whole idea of the East African Grant Makers Association was to have a directory of African grant makers. It was organized under the aegis of Ufadhili. And when we did a directory of Africans in East Africa who had the capacity to make grants, you would be amazed. There are very many of them. But most of them are also caught up in these Western models. So it is not true to say that Africans do not have models of philanthropy. We do. If you go to the gentleman whose book I've read, Nana Kobinan Ketsia in Ghana, under the systems that you find in Ghana, there are grants that the Oman Hen, who is the chief, gives to his community, and people bring money to him and he shares with the community. The Oni of Ife in Nigeria, or the Alafin of Oyo in Nigeria, who are the traditional chieftaincies, have programs which they run, which are informed by the tradition. If you go to the Kabaka Foundation in Uganda, there is no shortage. The only thing is that they are not as well publicized. And today I can tell you there are over 1,000 African millionaires in dollar terms who are capable of supporting African initiatives. In order for us to liberate ourselves from these Western, that is not to say that we don't borrow from them. We borrow creatively. Just don't need to borrow from the West only. We can borrow from other initiatives. What we can then do is to come up with models, which models are going to be useful and sensitive to the reality. And I've given you a personal example. For the Pierre Lumumba Foundation has never received a cent from any of these donor organizations. And I'm present in 39 African countries, 39. And people are doing what they can. They are in agriculture, they are in cyber cafes, and they generate funds. One of the things that we tell them, don't ever ask for money from Ford Foundation, from Heinrich Böll, from Konrad Adenauer, don't. We'll get you money from Africans. It's been working since 1990. We are not as well publicized, but we have a model which has borrowed from others, and a model which therefore can be improved. And in that way, I enjoy the freedom. I can say what I'm saying, because even if I annoyed somebody from Ford Foundation, I'm not going to ask for money from Ford Foundation, so I can speak freely. But those who are going to ask for money from Ford Foundation or Konrad Adenauer Foundation had better measure their words, because they'll need them and they'll remember how boldly you spoke. The last thing that I'm saying is this: I'm not convinced for one moment that if we disengage, we find ourselves in a situation where there are people who want to help. If somebody wants to help you, it must be time-bound. Help must be time-bound. Have you ever had a conversation with any of these donor organizations and asked them, you've been in Kenya for 20 years, when are you leaving Kenya? When are you leaving Africa? When will you consider your work to have been done and finished? Do they have a program of exiting the scene? No, they intend to exist in perpetuity. They intend to be helping people in Kibera in perpetuity, because philanthropy is an industry and poverty has also become an industry. But if we were to engage with them, Ford Foundation will say, we helped you for 10 years. We are now going back to the United States and will continue our activities in different areas. And I'm saying that we in the African continent are being helped in very basic areas. I don't want somebody to be giving me water, surely. I don't want somebody from Europe to be giving me antiretrovirals, surely. I don't want somebody under the guise of 1 acre to be giving me seed to plant in my rural home in Kenya. I don't want that. I can do that. But we have now been made to believe that unless they give us that, unless they give us tree seedlings, we cannot do it. We are waiting. We have created an army of people across Africa who, as a Nigerian author once said, they are simply waiting for Godot to bring the things that they long wanted, and until Godot comes, they are not going to do something for themselves. And I'm suggesting, Al, that you who are in that space and the others in that space, the conversation must now begin with this organization. You are here, you've been good to us, but there is a time that you must leave. And I conclude my answer with this particular statement, which I want you to see if those of you who have watched the film Gandhi by Sir Richard Attenborough, give me just one latitude that I may make this statement, it will make the point. Mahatma Gandhi is fighting for the independence of India. One of his greatest confidants is a clergyman called Charlie Andrews. In 1947-46, Charlie Andrews receives an invitation to leave India to go for Fiji, but he does not want to go. This is what Mahatma Gandhi tells him. Charlie, we have been good friends. Between me and you, there will be no goodbyes. But I want you to accept the assignment in Fiji, because their time has come when Indians must now believe that they can do it themselves. When they know that they can do it themselves, it will be dignifying for them. They'll begin to appreciate that labor is dignified. They'll begin to know that they can do it themselves. That is not to say that we do not need help. We may need it, but allow us to ask for it when we have tried and we are stuck. That is my message.
Thank you so much, Professor PLO Lumumba, for that message. And I think it has been well received across the board and very, very inspiring for all of us. I am going to not say anything more about what you have said just now. And I am going to invite my friend Stan Getui, who is a principal at Luminate, to now come forth and invite his panel that includes Ford Foundation and Hewlett Foundation, and so that they can have a conversation with us around the things that they have heard and around what realities they deal with. So Stan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Al. Can you hear me?
We hear you just fine.
Thanks again for time. It's always a hard act to follow when you have to speak after Professor PLO Lumumba, who has been an idol of mine for a very long time. I'd like to thank him and the panelists who spoke before us for being generous with their insights and their time. I now have the privilege of inviting some of my colleagues to respond. I agree with some of the comments that Professor PLO made, including the fact that we do now have some of the best minds. Philanthropy has been successful in recruiting both great men and women to do work on both the funder space and the CSO space. And I think one of the things which I've come to learn in the few years that I've been active in this space is that you cannot let perfection get in the way of progress. And I think it's a lot of, it's testament to this is the fact that we have a panel of 4 Africans based in Africa, 3 in Nairobi and 1 in Dakar, who will be speaking over the next few minutes. Similar to the previous session, I will not take too much time introducing Dia, Mary, and Margaret, who bring to us a wealth of experience, having worked in this sector for a very long time. But I'll let each of them speak about their respective organizations in response to the questions that have been raised by the panelists before on the CSO group, but also by Professor PLO Lumumba. Just with an eye on time, I can see we don't have as much time as we had allocated for this session. So we'll just cover a few things on trends, on a lot of the comments that people have raised about restricted funding, about the onerous level of financial reporting. But I think it will be a space for us to also respond quite candidly about some of the challenges we also face about in the work that we are doing in this space. There's no particular order to this conversation. I'm hoping it's going to be fairly fluid, and we'll leave Q&A until the end. But to open, I'll ask Mary Karinki, who comes to us based in DC, but she's Kenyan, and she's at the National Endowment for Democracy, to speak about some of the trends that she has been seeing over the last decade and what she feels is going to be supporting acceleration of change in our space to allow us to be a bit more responsive to the needs of the citizens. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Stan, and thank you for the panelists and the organizers of this event. And it was quite an interesting, it's been interesting deliberations today. And In terms of trends, I would say, I think a little bit of it was covered by Rose when she was talking about the pandemic and really how we've had to change the model of how we work, and with the rise of technology where we've had to move into virtual spaces. But I think we've also seen a lot of issues in terms of the inclusivity and diversity becoming a major theme in terms of the work that we are starting to do as funders. And so we've had to, of course, internally review our own policies and also ensure that we're targeting, those kinds of issues with the groups that we're supporting. I'd also maybe talk about issues around, the demographic dividend that has changed globally, as we have seen, numbers of young people who are now at the forefront of the drivers of change in most of the countries that we are in. And so having to make our approaches a bit more agile and much more robust to really meet this younger generation of people that are now being able to make these decisions or even calling for these decisions. I think we've also seen, the usual economic and inequality challenges and social and, political divides in most of the countries that we are also working in, and trying to address those issues, with funding also dwindling in most of these agencies. We're also having to also, really be a bit more strategic and tactful about where we put our resources and where we definitely see the value for money. So I think those are a couple of trends that I definitely see and that have started accelerating a lot of the changes that you're going to be seeing or are seeing with a lot of organizations starting to either restructure or, changing and moving regional focus, based on where they see where the need is needed. So yeah, standard. Those are some of the things I'll be looking towards, but happy to answer any particular questions on this.
Can I push you a bit on the regional one before we move on to the next panelist? I think just to speak a bit more about the intentional efforts that your organization has been taking, but also just recognizing any other moves in the space to ground the work a bit closer to the context.
Definitely. And I think, with the NED, as most of you may be familiar, our core mandate is really supporting democracy and governance programs. So our theme is quite very specific. We don't fund drilling of boreholes or providing water for communities. But I think what we have started seeing, as everybody can agree and attest to, is just the democracy has very much dwindled in the last few years. And so we have several closed countries. And what has happened is that we've had to, sort of change up our methodology in terms of how we address some of these countries that we work in. A lot of it has meant regional programming, where we are not able to, provide funding to organizations that are working in those specific countries. We've then had to look at other countries, neighboring countries that can be able to be used as sort of the anchors for those particular programs. We've allowed for much more robust thinking. I think one of the key things that, and I'm glad Ford Foundation is here, is that it's also about donor collaboration, especially in those closed spaces. Maggie and I work very closely in the East Africa region to, look at some of the trends in closed civic spaces and how we as donors collectively can be able to address it. So it's really much more of a regional approach versus, sometimes a very, country context where you're not necessarily able to program or provide particular grants. And so we've done a lot of testing, some approaches here and there. One donor does this and the other watches to see whether it's a model that can be scaled up, and then we are able to even have sort of like a basket funding or funding the same organization. So there's been that sort of collaboration within some certain donors, not everybody, but a few donors. Back to you, Stan.
Thanks a lot for that, and thanks for mentioning the boreholes. I'll be pleased to announce to Professor Pielo that no one on this panel is engaged in the provision of water services. I think we all have our opinions about
that is very good.
But
let us get our own water.
I think we choose to engage in, I wouldn't say higher level issues, but I think the change happens in different ways in different spaces. But not to lose sight of what we're discussing, Mary did mention some quite important points about young people, about youth. All the panelists on this session are youth by heart or by age. And I think it does point to the population that we have in Africa. Fairly young, I think more than 55% of the population is below the age of 35. They make up the electorate. they're the ones who suffer a lot of the harms that we have discussed and Professor PLO has put to light as well. We're also lucky to have Margaret Mliwa, who has been doing an amazing body of work with youth across East Africa. She comes from the Ford Foundation, who I have been told are one of the better funders in our space. So I'd like to let her speak a bit about Ford East Africa's focus on youth. And I might put you a bit on the spot. I think to cover the journey that you have had in the time you've been at Ford as a PO, the change in strategy and where you landed as a team with a focus now on youth, which in my mind is very reflective of where the issues are in our space, the population we're trying to address, but also the key stakeholders in our countries in the next decade or so. So handing over to Margaret for the next few minutes.
So thank you so much, Stan, and all the organizers of this forum. I just want to, first of all, start by making an addition about the trends that Mary has mentioned. And one of the things that as a learning foundation we have noted is there's been quite, for some time, there's been dwindling donor funding. And one of the things that we have constantly, again, looked at, and this speaks to Professor Lumumba's point on philanthropy, is looking into ways in which we can continuously support growing of local philanthropy. And I think that speaks again to what Grace was sharing on KCDF, their journey. I think that's something I wanted to point out. I also wanted to point out the issue around civic space, which Mary has mentioned. And we can take note that even as we look at the work that is happening around us, we find that the partners we are working with, because of one reason or the other, reason in terms of the closing of civic space, then they are not able to access the funds that they need to access. And I think this is where organizations like the Ford Foundation, NED, come in to really support that nature of organizations. Now, going back to your question regarding young people and why we are focusing on young people. And I just want to say that we are not only focusing at young people, we are looking at the marginalized groups, and we are looking at women, we are looking at young people, we are looking at people with disability. And the question that comes every time we are looking at is they are also making a difference wherever they are. And talking about the demographics, you note that the median age for East Africa is 19. Median age for East Africa is 19 years. Then that means the whole of the region is youthful. And the fact that they're youthful, they have different ways in which they are also seeing issues. And then the question that we have to ask ourselves, if we are supporting civil society organization, what does this mean for this demography? What does it mean for women? What does it mean for people with disability? And more than often, you will note that funding, because there are also perceptions which many people have regarding young, youthful organizations. Are they able to manage funds? They may not have even the structures, the systems that ought to be there for a funder to be able to support them. We are seeing new forms of organizing, like movement building. The question is, who is willing to support such creative, innovative, advocacy groups that are also in their own way contributing to change in the community. So there is the whole of that picture around what is happening in the space, and then this makes us make a very deliberate shift of mind to start asking ourselves, how best do we support these marginalized groups? And I want to say that sometimes it's not difficult. It's not easy to find these very groups. Reason being, they may be doing their work wherever they are doing. Their focus is not really on funding. Their focus is in making the change that they want to make. So I think it's also calls for us as the funders to develop a little bit curiosity, make sure that our ear is on the ground, just to listen and hear who is doing what and what are they doing. And it's out of this, then we can be able to meet the young people, because more than often they are under-resourced, they are underfunded. And again, the funding must not, I have had, I mean, in the conversation we had this afternoon, this evening, there are quite a number of people saying more than often donors can pull you out from your vision, but we must not even pull these young people from our vision. And I think if we look at the marginalized groups, we have to come from a place of trust, that even when we are giving these funds, they will be used for the right reasons, and that they don't have to necessarily have all the systems in place for them to tick all the due diligence questions, but all the same, they are capable of contributing to the change that we very much want to see. And then I also want to mention that the foundation, the Ford Foundation, has also started what we call the Ford Global Fellowship. Now, this Ford Global Fellowship, what we do is we try to identify the underfunded or under-resourced, and we are looking at the under-resourced and then the underserved organizations or individuals. And it's out of that, then we bring them, or rather identify them and join them with a community, you know, of learning that is global in nature. And we believe in so doing, then we are raising voices of the young people, of the women, and also those with disability. I think that's what I would love to respond as far as your concern is concerned.
Thanks a lot, Margaret. Can I push a bit on your work with marginalized groups? I think a lot of the things that come up in our space is language and how we define what marginalized groups are. Now, when you go about your work at the Ford Foundation, how do you typically define groups that have been previously marginalized?
So for us, we look at quite a number of dimensions. First of all, you have also to look at in terms of ageism, and that's why we are talking of young people. We look at in terms of gender. And then when we are looking even at the ageism, gender, disability, we are also looking at geographic locations, because you may have, or rather you may have programs of young people who are working in, for instance, in Nairobi, and they may be more advantaged than those who are working in a place like Turkana or Ajia or Marsabit. So we have also to do a balance to see, then if we are working this with the marginalized groups, how do we define these marginalized groups? And as I mentioned, there are quite a number of the issues. And then we also move on to, even when we are looking at the spaces and talking about gender, we are also asking ourselves, what are the power dynamics that are appearing in the gender sector, and how do we then reach these different groups so that even in the power dynamics that are there, we look at how then these connect. Likewise to the young people, we have young people who are living in rural areas, who are doing some amazing work and may not have had the opportunities to go, or rather to have higher learning, go to institutions of higher learning. So how do we also engage with those? So the marginalized groups here is really deliberate, in the sense that we have to continuously be open to learning and gleaning, gleaning out what is happening in the communities, the voices that we are hearing, to continuously also adjust our support to these groups.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Just noting that there was a question in the chat from Rose, but I might leave that until the end. A lot of gems have popped up in that conversation, things around flexible funding, working with groups that don't have formal structures. So we'll leave that until we finish with broader thematic questions. Dia hasn't spoken yet. She joins us from the Hewlett Foundation, and I'm posting something in the channel that our CAGs drafted a few weeks or months ago. And I must say that I felt pretty bad or sad or salty about it, because he was speaking about Hewlett being the gold standard for how philanthropy should be. I say salty because I'm one of his funders, and for him to be saying nice things about Hewlett and not Illuminate got me thinking about the work we've been doing for the last 2 years. But I think Hewlett has probably been down this journey of going through a few strategy reviews. And I'm going to ask Dia to speak about the work they've done reviewing their 2020 strategy, and just speak a bit more about their mode of philanthropy, especially with the work they're trying to do in the African space, but also how they've shifted their funding model. I saw the comment about water and sanitation, and they shift to, I think, work which is more closer to democracy and some of the spaces where we're active. So let's Dia speak to that before we jump on to the next part of that session. Dia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. How many minutes do I have, Stan?
Go for your life. I'll start with my hands frantically if you go on for too long.
You know, some of us like to be prepared. Okay, thank you very much. So for me, I would like to start by saying that when I was hearing Professor Lumbumba speaking, I just realized the lack of knowledge that is mine. So I'm really looking forward to hear more about this foundation, because having worked on the continent for 15 years around issues of development and human rights, I can't believe that I didn't realize we had such a gem in our crown. Some of you, I saw some names, know me as a very radical anti-philanthropy, pro-decolonizing, and very proud Pan-African. So you might be wondering, what do I do now working at the Hewlett Foundation? Stan, the article that you posted will give some of the answers. Thank you very much. I think I was always looking for an answer to the bravery, the self sacrifice that I saw in my comrades as an activist. And in my last position before I joined the Hewlett Foundation, I was working for Amnesty International. And what was always putting a lot of shame on me as a regional coordinator for youth and activism on the continent was when we had like trained and, advised rioting people to say, yes, you need a change in your country. Yes, we will work with you. Then the issue of money would come, and we would very embarrassedly say, sorry, we don't have the money. And so this is what has drawn me to this organization, is that the Hewlett Foundation that I joined now 6 months, a little more, 8 months ago, says that it's a foundation that is trying to do governance support and development and human rights support in a different way. Some of the questions that were asked around, do you do core funding or project funding? I think all of us sitting around this virtual table of funders have heard recommendation times and times again. Hewlett is trying to walk the talk, walk the walk, I never know, saying that 1, we believe in core funding. 2, we believe in long-term partnerships. 3, on very horizontal partnership, meaning everything we heard from Professor Lumumba, which is very true for a number of funders. We are trying not to be that kind of funder. We don't believe in harassing people around for reports, in directing their agendas, and you can hold me to this. And we also believe that, the program officers that are being brought to the table now in the foundation are very different from those that were brought around the table 10 years ago. I'm the first African, not even African woman, but I'm the first African to be hired outside of the US. And after me, another comrade was hired. And I think this signals a will not only to listen politely to the ground, but to bring within the midst of the foundation some people who might have different views. Where are our different views? My predecessors believed heavily in the fact that to solve the crisis that our continent is going through, and also Mexico, which is another place where we operate as a transparency, participation, and accountability team, that the solution lied in ensuring that we monitor what the government, we support those who monitor what government does around providing services, that we support 2/3 of our portfolio around INGOs who work on water sector or health or sanitation, and that we really focus at global norm setting. And that, yes, when we support at the local level some initiatives that might be groundbreaking. One thing that I think we do differently is that, for instance, you wouldn't see a call for proposal from the Hewlett Foundation. Some people might say that this is a gatekeeping exercise and it's better to open it to the world. But I think what is good is that we have the latitude as program officer to identify some opportunities within the countries where we work. And when you have the chance that I got, which is to join at a time where people are reviewing their strategy, we bring our own beliefs into the process. And this is why we have shifted towards movement building, towards looking at how do we support the ecosystem of civil society within the countries where we work. We speak about supporting, I think it's work in progress at the moment. We are saying that it's underserved populations, for a lack of a better word. We are still looking for help in finding the right term, but we haven't defined that in the 5 to 6 countries where we want to focus our efforts. Why? Because we believe it's not for us to decide that. It's for people on the ground to decide and to help us co-create country implementation plans in Kenya, in Senegal, in Ghana, in Burkina Faso, in Mexico, and in Tanzania. We are hoping to do that in the next month. And we really, I think Margaret said a lot that we are trying to do. I think Ford is the big sister on that side. And I think it comes from the fact that they also attracted a lot of radical feminist activists and human rights activists within their ranks. We are really hoping that we can address in those countries the asymmetries of power wherever they lie, not only between government and civil society, but even within the ranks of civil society, and that we will try to do that by looking at of course, the usual transparency angles around information, media, and governance, other governance structure, but that we really want to focus on the participatory element and looking at, for a lack of a better word again, who we are leaving behind. So I think for me, I regret that this platform stopped me from hearing everyone, but what I have heard and what I read in the nice notes that Stan provided are things that we are trying to do at the Hewlett Foundation. And I think that in the next 5 years, what we want to see as a shift in the world of philanthropy is for more funders to join us in this humble acknowledgement that we are just hosted for lunch and that we are not here to stay for dinner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear, for those very
Good. I
powerful
like
comments.
the idea of being hosted for lunch and no dinner.
I thought that would resonate with you. And I always say my job as a funder is to be a translator, is to understand the things that are in context and ensure that the people on the other side understand what we're trying to do. I think Dear did make the point that there's been a big shift in terms of having people on the ground, the way they look, the way they sound, the way they've been schooled, which I think is also testament to the fact that it's shifting and somewhat slowly, but I think we're slowly getting there. I'll speak a bit about the work that we do at Luminate as well. everyone on this call, on the panel, is a big sister of Luminate. We've been around for about 3 years, so we are quite new in this space. But it's one of those funny things. I always make the joke that my late brother is the one who used to clear the path for me and made everything for me a lot easier. I think between NED, groups like Open Societies, Ford, Hewlett, there's been a lot of learning, which I think doesn't get appreciated a lot of the time. Because the job of a funder is to be, one, a financial partner, but also play a quite critical role as an arbiter of information to document learnings, to accept failure, and in the face of those things, make quite aggressive shifts in the way that we're funding. And on the back of that, Luminate has been around for 3 years. We, as of 8 months ago, used to be in 16 countries in 5 regions. We took the decision in March to shift to Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. To Professor PLO's comment earlier, we have a lot of upset people who've been based in the US, in Western Europe, because we no longer fund in that space. And I think if you hear the countries that Dio was speaking to on Hewlett's side, it's a shift away from, I don't like the term global north, but there are countries where we are working now in, I think, a bit more reflective of the challenges that are in place. And I think, as I said, perfection progress. I'd like to believe that we're making small steps in that direction as well. I might shift slightly to respond as well and to be respectful of the comments that were made earlier on the CSO panel. Quite passionate about things like restricted versus core funding. And I'd like to let Mary, going from NED, speak about those ones first. I think a pointed question, do you provide core funding? Are you flexible in whether you fund? And what are the things that you look for when you're making those decisions? And I'd ask that you be quite candid, and I'd let my other colleagues speak as well once you're done.
Sure. And maybe to just also echo Gassama's point, you know, NED is also similar to Hewlett in terms of we also don't have a call for proposal. And I think it allows us to receive quite interesting ideas from anybody, you know, whether it's a grassroots organization or a, you know, a well-established civil society organization. We do provide core funding. We do provide, I think NED is one of the most flexible foundations or endowments. And I think what I would say is that it's really a process where there's a bit of co-creation, and also it's what the organization tells us that they need. So we found you know, in some closed spaces, where, for example, some funders are exiting because of either, you know, the governments are coming hard on them, or there's some changes within their funding structures, where then NED has stepped in to provide support to some of those civil societies to sort of bridge the gap in terms of fund, you know, to meet their day-to-day running costs. So I think that's something that NED has done and continues to do, and it's really driven by the civil society organization needs. And I would even want to echo is that I think the co-creation cannot be downplayed. I think people throw in that word just very loosely and just so that it sounds nice. I think it's important that as funders, we really, you know, need to think about how we build in mechanisms within our granting mechanisms to have this co-creation. Of course, there are funders that, you know, will use the, you know, sort of like your annual APS systems or your proposal calls for proposal systems. But I think, you know, how do we sit down with an organization? You pitch for us an idea, we listen to it, and we ask, you know, the necessary questions to ensure that you've interrogated the ground and the context and make sure that it is realistic. And then, you know, there is then that back and forth that allows us to make sure that, you know, whatever you're saying that you're trying to achieve, that it is achievable within that period of time. And another thing that I would want to say is also, I think NED has also traditionally, it was 1 year grants that had been the sort of practice for a long, long time. But I think we have come to the realization that I think it's just not realistic. I've always made the argument that within 1 year, you have 2 months of a startup and 2 months of a close down of a project. So ideally, it's not really, you know, a year of implementation. So we are now moving to long-term grants. Right now, I think we are at a 2 year to 3 year cycle, or rather 2 to 3 year period that we can be able to fund partners. Yeah. Back to you, Stan.
Thank you, Mary. I'll put Margaret on the spot, ask her to speak to some of the reasons why program or restricted funding is an option sometimes. What are the things that force the hand or rather, what is the criteria you look at that gets you to that point with some organizations that you fund? I know you'd mentioned some things about working with youth, having a lack of formal structures. Do you mind expanding a bit more on the reasons why sometimes a program or restricted funding is the best way to go?
Yeah, so just to echo what my sister Di and Mary mentioned, we realize more and more that it's not easy to measure, to just measure change and say in 1 year's time, as one of the speakers mentioned, that in 1 year's time, we need to see this happening. Because we take 10 steps forward and we can find ourselves taking 20 steps back. So we are looking at more of, as a foundation, we're looking more of how do we resource whole organizations? Because when you look at an organization, we are not just looking at those activities. We are looking at who is doing what in those activities. So we are all looking at a whole organization where we are looking at the human resource, we are looking at the board, we are looking at staff in terms of policies that could help that organization grow. So in terms of that, then what we are constantly looking for is how do we give more and more unrestricted funding. Now, I just want to make example. I explain what the types of funding we have. Like we have 3 types of funding, 2 types of funding, but others come on a need basis. Like for one, we have regular funding, and these regular fundings are small grants that we can give to organizations. But once the organizations have a 501c, then they're eligible to get unrestricted grants. That could be 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, depending on the conversations that we've had. And then we also have what we call build grant. These are long-term grants, 5 years grants and restricted grant. And mainly, some of the principles that we look at is how is the organization embedded in the ecosystem? Is the organization an ecosystem builder? We are asking ourselves, what is the potential of supporting this organization to the next level? And when we do that, we have in mind that there are many types of organizations within the work that we are doing, like the ones Stan has mentioned, youthful organization or youth-led organization, women-led organization that may not have the systems. Then what we do is one of the great things which Diane and Mary have mentioned, we accompany the organizations. In fact, our key word is that our grantees at the driver's seat. What we do is we join the vehicle and sit as the drivers, because we must not make decisions for them on what they want to do. It has to be a decision that is made by the grantee. And that's why we are also, just like other speakers said, we are also quite open and tell grantees when they come and they want to fit within the Ford Foundation strategic area, we say, no, we don't want you to veer off your vision. And we want to ask you to look for another funder who can help you continue the vision. And I think one of the things that, I think one of the questions that was asked in the chat was how does Ford fund or identify groups that we fund? And just like Dara said, this is actually one of the things that we really are keen on, and we listen. So it's around really listening to people who is doing what. And in the conversations, certain names or rather certain organizations come again and again and again. And then we have to really do again the due diligence to find out whether what we have had corresponds with what the organizations are doing. And then secondly, it's not an easy task, Rose, because there are also power dynamics we have to be constantly aware of in these conversations that we go on. For instance, when I am speaking with someone, and the fact that I come from the funders side, immediately the conversation changes. And I think I liked what Professor Lumumba mentioned, that you can say anything when you know you don't have anything to lose. But again, we encourage very honest conversations, conversations that do not necessarily want to box you. We want, because whether your organization is doing well or it's not doing well, one of the things that we are very aware of is we can work with you in that journey to rectify some of the things you yourself as a civil society organization have identified. And then I wanted to mention, Stanley, that our funding model really is on, we look at three things. One, we fund ideas. So that means sometimes it's not necessarily that the organization is grounded in all the paperwork that they need to. But if the idea is great, then that is something we need to test and see how it works. We also look at institutions, and then we look at and then at the institutions again. I mentioned we look at how the institution, what role the institution plays in the ecosystem, and how is it going to support building of the ecosystem. And then finally, individuals. So we also do fund individuals that are innovative, that are creative, that are thinking, and that need really support. So I think one of the things that we are also continuously pushing, just like Dia and Mary mentioned, is unrestricted grants, that organizations have the free will to do what they want to do. And then it gives them the opportunity now when they go to bilateral donors or donors who can only provide project funds, then they also have the flexibility to be themselves and to do the things that they desire to do.
Thank you very much, Mari, for those comments. I might tie that into what Dia had said earlier on about her being an anti-philanthropist. And I think some of the things which she now wants to do differently now that she sits on the other side of the table. I remember when I joined Illuminate, the former managing director, Oriol Kolo, said you have to have, I think, be careful about the power of the hammer. So just a question to Dia on how you engage with groups in your space and how you manage that tension, but just ensure that you have empathy for the work that they do.
Thank you very much, Stan. I think it all starts with humility and saying it, that we are no different and that we are operating at the service of those who serve. I don't know if it translates, but it's really the idea that in any contact that I have with the grantees that I work with or with potential grantees, it's always to let them know that their experience, their traumas with other donors, it's not what they will encounter in the relationship with the Hewlett Foundation. And also to ask them to hold us accountable as often as they want. They have the number of the president on speed dial, and really it's really to ensure that we have a healthy relationship that is based on the truth. And the truth sometimes lies in undisclosing, what people are used to hide from the donor, you know, like things are not going well in the leadership transition, or you hired someone who is not yet to the level that you need. All those things, we really encourage people to have frank conversation with us, to disclose all the costs of what they want to do. And we see ourselves as supporting the realization of their dreams. Because at the end of the day, we are here in a position where we are disbursing some money. The money is not unlimited, unfortunately, but there's this idea that for me, if I joined philanthropy, it's just that I thought, you know, okay, people are not evil. It's just that they don't know sometimes. And if you find a space where people are willing to hear, I'm not saying that Yakumba has the whole truth about the whole of Africa, but at least I'm able to identify those that I see at the margin of funding and of support. Somebody spoke about capacity building. People have the ideas on the continent, and in the particular field where I operate in democratic governance, we know that the level of insecurity and the level of, you know, people say, oh, you're not registered, we can't fund you, or the agenda that you're pushing for can be equated to terrorism and all those things. I am able to get into that conversation and say, these people are really trying to operate a change that takes time and that they are doing at the threat of their life, at the risk of their life. So if we can do something for them to stay alive and for their struggle to succeed, then we will be happy to do it. I was telling somebody that the colleagues from Open Society, there's somebody in that organization who is capable to say that when everyone, I'm sorry for the background noise, when everyone was running away from the young people of Burkina who were trying to effect change in their country, that someone in Open Society pushed the button to say, let's release the funds. And this literally saved a lot of lives because they had the logistics for their struggle. So this is my dream as a philanthropist. I have an 8 years mandate. In 8 years, if I'm capable of saying that I've contributed to young people in all their diversity, women in all their diversity on our continent, to be able to do whichever struggle they believe is the priority for them, even if sometimes I won't agree, you know, with some positions, but it's not my place to judge. It's my place to support what the people want for their people. Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me? I dropped for a few seconds there, just checking if my audio is working. Hello.
We hear you fine.
And yeah,
Okay,
hear
cool.
you.
All right, so sorry about that. Thanks again, dear. And thanks for making that point about partnership. I always say to our CAGs that you should never introduce me as a donor, that we are partners and we work alongside each other in the spaces where we're active. I want to shift a bit to a comment that Erica made earlier, and I think it has come up a few times in the discussion right now about non-financial support and how critical we see this as a form of engagement with the groups that we fund. I think Rose did mention that as well, as did Geshi. I might ask Margaret to speak to it a bit because Ford with Build probably has the most extensive and expansive partner or technical support program. I think just to speak about Build, the lessons you learned and how critical you find financial support to be for the work that we do.
So thank you once again, Stan. So when we look at non-financial support, actually we talk about beyond the dollar support. And beyond the dollar support is a very important component in the work that we are doing. Now, focusing on Build, I think one of the things that we allow organizations to do is do their own organizational assessment. So they use their organizational assessment tool, try and pull out what is it that they feel from their own past, and they don't need to share with us the report of the assessment, organizational assessment. It's theirs for the learning and using. And from there, then we have a number, we have several sort of beyond the dollar support or capacity development. One is through financial resilience, just helping the organization. This is an organization that has got unrestricted funding for 5 years. And I noted that Awala mentioned about the cost recovery. So if you've gotten an amount of five years and restricted grant, how do we support you to develop that financial resilience, including having your own funds that can run the organization? So we are that flexible to the extent that an organization can grow its own fund and keep the funds for at such a time that they are unable to get any donor funding. So that there is that component of financial resilience. And then there's also a part in which we support women leaders, specifically those who are working in some of the grants, the build grants that we are talking about. And this is around also leadership, issues around coaching, and really supporting them to meet, or rather to be able to look at the work that they are doing and come up with decisions around how best they want, and then also connect them with their peers. And more than often, again, we look at exchange programs in terms of how do we link organizations, like-minded organizations. And as mentioned earlier on, partnerships or rather coalitions can never be forced. They have to somehow be organic. So it's also creating a community of learning. And in that community of learning, organization organically align, or rather organically connect, and they start this journey of learning. So we have quite a number of ways in which we really think that connection, that capacity it's great, including even experiential learning, where encouraging organizations to do some exchanges and make sure. And out of this, we still give small grants to help in the logistics and support around that. But for the purposes of the build grant, then that remains part of the work that they will need to budget to do that capacity. Of late, we have also speaking with a number of our partners, come up with what we call resource hubs. And in the resource hubs, then what we are thinking about is building the ecosystem of civil society. Now, the ecosystem as many of you have mentioned, issues of institutional strengthening and partly financial resilience are really more and more confronting us at the work that we are doing. So how best do we, for instance, resource South-based organizations that are founded within the region to continuously think about more creative ways, including even local philanthropy? How do they start, inspire citizens to start funding some of the initiatives that are being run by individuals, civil society? We are also looking at issues about issues on human rights defenders. Instead of looking for external mechanisms, what mechanisms do these organizations have, and how can they grow those local mechanisms to continue doing the work of protection of human rights defenders? And then we're also looking at another resource hub that also builds the ecosystem of wellness, not only just of organizations, but we're looking at wellness of those working in the organizations, those working in the civic space, activists, and just reflect on the work that they are doing, and constantly have conversations that can help. And all this that we do is actually really grounded. It's grantee-led. It's them, our partners, who need to identify, and then we can support that. And I think that has really gone a long way in even growing the young people organizations, women-led organizations, and also disability-led organizations. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I'll be handing over in about 5 minutes here. In 2 or 3 minutes, do you mind speaking about the things that you wish you saw a bit more? I'd like to thank Geshe for calling out things around theory of change, clarity, and purpose. But I'd like to let each of the panelists speak about some of the things they wish they saw a bit more that could help them and the work that they do in this journey a bit easier. I'll start with Margaret, and then Dia, then finish off with Mary. So Margaret, over to you again, just in terms of what you wish you could see.
Yeah, what I wish I could see is a more honest and open conversations between us and the civil society. And I just want to take note that we have the interest of our communities at heart. And when there is honesty in terms of the challenges that you are going through, then it becomes easier for us to support. But when we go back to the traditional donor relationship, then it becomes very difficult for us to walk alongside you. So I'm encouraging everyone, when we have this conversation, let's be honest, share your areas where you feel you are challenged. Then we can be able to walk better with you and support in that.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Dia?
Thank you very much. I'm known to be someone who is very good at inciting people. That's what the government said to refuse me access to that country a few years back. So I would like to see more of people refusing bad practices. When a donor, because those kind of people can be called like this and be proud of it, decides to act in a way that is disrespectful, that is hampering your work, and that is enslaving you, I'm inviting you to refuse and denounce it. Nowadays, the social media is there. New York Times seems to have democratized. Guardian, everyone put the word out there, name and shame people. This is the only way that it will change. And I think that that's what I would want to see more of first. The second one is what I'm starting to see with the Ford Foundation. We are aligned in our thinking of really serving our communities and reaching the most hard to reach. I would like to see more of this open conversation between funders, like-minded funders. And I would also want us to play a big role in having, how do you say it, peer-to-peer truth telling and naming and shaming between us, because everybody knows about who are the worst of the class. And I think that it's about time that we, say it out loud. And this is the only way things will change. And last but not least, to quote Professor Lubumba, I would like us to spend 30% of our time thinking about how we're going to contribute to the exit strategy and for people not to need us by whichever date we decide. Shall we do like the SDGs, 2030?
Stanley, I guess I can hop in.
Yes.
Yes. I think, just maybe to kind of recap would be, for me, as I even interact with a lot of civil society organizations, what I would definitely want to see is really genuine collaborations. And one of the issues we always tend to, in as much as we don't definitely want to see forced collaborations and forced marriages, but I do think that some work that we do does lend itself for greater impact if there is collaboration. And so I would want to see that organizations are really thinking and assessing the ecosystem in which that they're operating in, and understanding what makes a better program if you're able to coordinate and collaborate with others. I think the issue of isolated project programming needs to come to an end, and thinking a bit more about the bigger picture. And even in aligning to that is having organizations sort of really be the drivers of what success looks like on a project or on a program. Because I think a lot of times what you find is a lot of organizations tend to cater to what the funder wants versus really looking and asking yourself, if you're going to be doing a human rights project, what does success look like? And again, having that honest conversation and saying, this is all that we will be able to accomplish within this period of time with these resources that we have. And I think one other thing that even, PLO did mention a bit, I think, is that not all money is good money. And I think, what has happened, it has killed the, the voluntarism culture that we have. And I think donors should really, or funders should really be asking more of what is community contribution that then looks at issues around sustainability. And as, Dia did say, what does an exit strategy look like? But if you don't begin those conversations at the onset, then, you're going to have the usual professional civil society workshop goers, the usual characters that you keep seeing over and over coming to events, and you're not really, targeting the real people who matter. So I think I'd want to see a shift in that as an individual and also as a funder.
Thank you all for those comments and for being very candid in your responses. I think I'll just, thank you. So I'll just close by saying nothing to add there, appreciating all the insights that we've had from the panelists, but also echoing their sentiments about, I think, just honesty, sharing challenges, but also just being brave about having clarity of purpose. I think all they say is that it's a lot easier to fund a team that has a clear strategy and has people in place to do the work, and just being honest about the learnings and the challenges you're facing as you do the work. I think it's fair to say for all the people on this side that we see you, we have a lot of empathy. We have a lot of sympathy for the work that you do, and we are in service of the work that you do and are massive fans and active promoters of the work that you do, and see the struggle and always appreciate the efforts that have been put out collectively across both the funders and the CSO side. Our CAGs, we have 8 minutes, so I'll graciously hand the panel back to you and the broader session for what I believe is a close. But thanks again for giving us the space to speak and to respond to the earlier session, and to Professor PLO.
Thank you so much to all of you. That was really a very powerful session. I don't have very much to say except for this. I have seen messages from some of you present here who have sent me, I received an SMS from someone who is a friend in the CSO space who has asked me, are you being brave or are you being stupid? At the time that especially at the time that PLO was speaking, because he's saying, you have Dia here, you have Stan here, you have Mary here, all three are my funders, and PLO is saying things that should in general upset them. And I want to say that, at the Open Institute, we've had the privilege of being able to work with people who allow us to be either brave or stupid, people who allow us to do things that, people who allow us to be ourselves, people who allow us to be authentic. We have had, I think in the early days, we've had occasion to say no to money, just simply because of the fact that the donor that we were going to work with, would not allow us to be authentic. These three funders that we have seen here are good examples of the kind of funding relationships that one would want to generate, and especially if we can make sure that we can have even the bilateral sort of funders take on that attitude. The conversation that we have had today for us is the beginning that is supposed to go even further. We don't want to sort of close it here, and we want to continue sort of engaging so that we can make as many CSOs and NGOs join the bandwagon of being as stupid and as brave as us, so that we can be able to speak truth, and so that we can be able to reach Professor PLO's aspiration that we begin to have the agency at the very least to decide how development is done, to drive solutions that we do have. So I want to say thank you first and foremost to all the participants that came in. I want to say thank you so much to the speakers, Rose, Chris, for the stories, Grace, Yessi and Rose, For the first panel, PLO, who has really given us a lot to think about, and to Stan, Dia, Mary, and Margaret, who we really, really value all those contributions. And thank you also for having the braveness to be true to the Buntwani spirit. We're going to close a few minutes early. Thank you so much. There's going to be tweets. There's going to be some of this video sent to you so that you can tweet for yourself what you feel we should talk about, what you feel we should air. And let's engage and keep this engagement alive. We shall call you again, and we hope that you will say yes. Thank you, and have a superb evening and day and afternoon, wherever it is that this finds you. Asante sana.